Imagine this. You are standing in a monastery carved directly into a cliff face, 1,000 feet above the ground, in the highlands of Ethiopia. The air is thin. The walls are covered in frescoes painted over 1,000 years ago, and a monk hands you a manuscript written on goatskin parchment in a language so ancient that only a few dozen scholars in the entire world can read it fluently. You ask him what it says, and he tells you it describes where St. Peter went before Rome. Now, most of us in the Western world grew up hearing the same story. Peter, the fisherman from Galilee, became the first pope of Rome. He was crucified upside down on Vatican Hill, and that is where his story ends and where the Catholic Church begins. But here is the question that thousands of history lovers have been asking lately, the kind of question that keeps you up at night. What happened to Peter during the years that the New Testament simply does not account for? Because when you actually sit down and read the biblical record carefully, there is a gap, a significant gap. Years where Peter's movements are either vague or completely missing from the historical record. So where was he? Today, we're going to follow a trail of evidence that leads us not west toward Rome, but south and east toward Alexandria, toward the Red Sea coast, and deep into the ancient Christian heartland of Africa. We are going to look at manuscripts that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has preserved for over a millennium. We're going to examine what early African Christian communities believed about Peter. And we are going to ask a question that Western history has largely avoided. Is it possible that some of the most important years of Peter's life were spent not in Europe, but in Africa? Stay with me, because what we find in those cliff monasteries might completely change the way you think about early Christian history. Let me know in the comments right now, before watching this video, did you believe Peter went straight to Rome, or did you always suspect there was more to the story? Let us start with what the official record actually says, and more importantly, what it does not say. The Roman Catholic Church has built an enormous amount of its theological authority on one central claim, that Peter, the apostle chosen by Jesus to lead his church, went to Rome, led the Christian community there, and was eventually martyred under Emperor Nero, somewhere around 64 to 68 AD. This claim matters enormously, because if Peter founded the church at Rome, then the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, carries a direct line of spiritual authority back to Jesus himself. That is the doctrine known as apostolic succession. And for over 15 centuries, it has been the bedrock of papal authority. So the institutional need for Peter to have been in Rome is not just historical, it is theological, it is political. It is, frankly, the foundation upon which an entire global institution rests, and that is exactly why we need to look at the evidence with fresh eyes. Because when you open the New Testament and search for explicit, clear, detailed evidence that Peter spent years in Rome, you encounter something surprising. You find almost nothing. The Book of Acts, which chronicles the early spread of Christianity in extraordinary detail, follows Peter closely through the early chapters. We see him in Jerusalem. We see him in Samaria. We see him in Joppa, in Caesarea. We even see him in Antioch. But then, around Acts chapter 12, Peter essentially disappears from the narrative. The text says simply that he left and went to another place. Another place. That is it. No destination, no explanation, no follow-up. Now pause on that for a second. The book of Acts is detailed enough to tell us that Paul's traveling companion had stomach problems. It records the name of a landlord in Corinth. It describes the exact port where ships docked. And yet, for one of the most important figures in all of early Christianity, it simply says he went to another place? That silence is extraordinary. And here is where it gets even more interesting. In his first letter, which we find in the New Testament, Peter includes a greeting at the end. He writes that the church at Babylon sends greetings. Babylon. Now, for centuries, Western scholars and church theologians have interpreted this as a coded reference to Rome, because by the time Peter was writing, Roman power was so oppressive toward early Christians that calling Rome Babylon after the great empire that had destroyed Jerusalem centuries before would have made symbolic sense. That interpretation may be correct, but it may not be, because there was also a real place called Babylon, a settlement located in northern Egypt, very close to what is now Cairo, on the eastern bank of the Nile. It was a Roman military garrison town. It was a real, historically documented location, and in the 1st century AD, it sat at the crossroads of major trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to East Africa. So when a viewer on our previous video about the 12 disciples commented that the word Babylon in Peter's letter has never been conclusively proven to mean Rome, they were not being fringe theorists. They were pointing to a legitimate debate among scholars. And that debate, that single unresolved question about one word in one letter, opens a door that leads us to Ethiopia. Drop a comment below. Which do you think Babylon means in Peter's letter, Rome or the actual city in Egypt? I am genuinely curious what this community thinks. In our previous video about the 12 disciples, we spent some time on a moment that generated more comments than almost anything else we have covered on this channel. It was the story of Bartholomew, also known as Nathaniel, and the manuscripts he reportedly carried into Africa. Ancient sources, including early church historians like Eusebius of Caesarea, writing in the 3rd and 4th centuries, describe Bartholomew as having traveled to India and to the regions that some historians interpret as covering parts of the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa. But the tradition preserved within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church goes further. According to Ethiopian ecclesiastical tradition, Bartholomew brought written texts, early records of the teachings and movements of the apostles, into the African continent. These texts were not the canonical Gospels as we know them. They were earlier, rougher documents, records of conversations, accounts of journeys, letters and communications between the apostles as they scattered across the known world. Now, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is the oldest continuously practicing Christian institution in the world. It was established, by its own historical account, in the 4th century through the conversion of King Ezana of the Aksumite Empire. But its oral traditions and certain manuscript records reach back even further, preserving accounts of contact with Judaism and with the earliest Christian missionaries dating to the 1st century itself. One of the most important collections of these ancient texts is known as the Synaxarium. This is a vast compilation of accounts of saints and martyrs, organized by the days of the Ethiopian calendar. It has been maintained and copied by Ethiopian monks for well over 1,000 years. And within the Synaxarium, there are references to gatherings of the apostles in Jerusalem before their great dispersal, where agreements were reportedly made about who would travel where, who would carry which teachings, and critically, who would maintain contact with whom afterward. These passages are not widely known in Western scholarship, partly because they are written in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia, which requires specialized training to read, partly because for much of the colonial period, African ecclesiastical sources were simply not treated as credible by mainstream European historians, and partly because the texts themselves exist in a world of manuscript libraries that are still being fully cataloged today. But here is what the Synaxarium and related Ethiopian texts suggest about Peter. They describe a correspondence, a series of communications between Peter and the earliest Christian communities in the African Northeast. Not a physical journey necessarily, but a documented relationship, a pastoral connection between the leader of the Jerusalem church and the nascent Christian networks developing along the Red Sea coast. And this is where the geography becomes important, because the Red Sea in the 1st century was not a barrier, it was a highway. The ancient Aksumite kingdom, which would eventually become the core of what we now call Ethiopia, controlled major ports on the Red Sea coast. Merchants, missionaries, and diplomats traveled regularly between the Arabian Peninsula, the Egyptian coast, and the Horn of Africa. For a man like Peter, who was a fisherman, who was accustomed to boats and water and coastal travel, this route would not have been extraordinary. It would have been entirely practical. Now here is something I want you to think about critically. The Gospel of Mark is almost universally accepted by scholars to have been written based on the eyewitness accounts of Peter. Mark was Peter's closest companion, his translator, his scribe, and Mark went to Alexandria. That is not a fringe theory. That is accepted historical and ecclesiastical consensus. The Coptic Orthodox Church of Egypt traces its founding directly to the evangelist Mark, who arrived in Alexandria, Egypt somewhere around 42 to 49 AD. Alexandria in the 1st century was not just a city, it was the intellectual capital of the world. It had the greatest library in human history. It had a massive Jewish population whose traditions Peter would have been deeply familiar with. It was a city of enormous spiritual and cultural significance. So, ask yourself this: if Peter was Peter's closest disciple, his traveling companion, his interpreter, and Mark went to Alexandria, is it really so implausible that Peter traveled with him or visited him there? What do you think? Has Western history underestimated the African connections of the early apostles? Tell me in the comments. Let us follow the thread more carefully. The traditional timeline for Peter, according to Western church sources, runs roughly like this. After the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, Peter remains in Jerusalem as the leader of the young Christian community. He travels within the region of Judea and Samaria. He makes a trip to Antioch in Syria, where Paul famously confronts him. And then, at some point, he makes his way to Rome, where he eventually dies. The problem is that this timeline has gaps of years, sometimes more than a decade, where the sources are either silent or vague. Early church historian Eusebius of Caesarea, in his Ecclesiastical History, written in the early 4th century, provides one of our most complete early accounts of apostolic movements. And even he, writing within the institutional framework of a church that had strong reasons to place Peter firmly in Rome, acknowledges that the details of Peter's journeys before his final arrival in Rome are incomplete. He was working from sources, some of which no longer exist. He was trying to reconstruct a history from fragments, and fragments, as any historian will tell you, leave room. Now, let us look at what the Ethiopian monastic tradition preserves. In the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved from solid volcanic rock in the 12th century, but housing traditions that reach back many centuries further, there are paintings and inscriptions that depict the apostolic period. In the cliff monasteries of the Tigray region, some of the oldest in the world, including Debre Damo, which dates back possibly to the 5th or 6th century, monks have maintained manuscript traditions that describe the earliest centuries of Christianity in Africa as a connected, living network, not a distant outpost receiving doctrine from Rome, but an active participant in the formation of Christian thought. And here is where we need to talk about something that rarely comes up in popular history. The city of Alexandria was the home of one of the largest Jewish communities in the ancient world. Peter, as a Jewish fisherman from Galilee, would have had natural connections to this community. The Jewish diaspora in Egypt was enormous, well established, and deeply integrated into the intellectual and commercial life of the city. When the first Christian missionaries arrived in Alexandria, they were not arriving as total strangers. They were arriving within networks that already existed: Jewish networks, trade networks, networks that stretched along the Red Sea coast and into the interior of East Africa. These networks were how ideas, texts, and religious practices moved in the ancient world, and the Ethiopian manuscripts suggest that Peter was aware of these networks, engaged with them, and perhaps traveled within them during those years that the Western historical record simply marks as unknown. Here's a question I want to leave open for this community to debate. If Western historians have largely relied on sources produced within the Roman Church, and the Roman Church had institutional reasons to place Peter's story in Rome, does that mean we should look at African sources with greater weight? Or do the African traditions have their own institutional biases worth examining? I think that is a genuinely fascinating debate, and I would love to see your thoughts in the comments. Let us step back for a moment and think about this from a historical and political perspective. In the first few centuries of Christianity, the religion was not a unified institution with a single center of authority. It was a diverse, decentralized movement, spreading through trade routes and diaspora communities across an enormous geographic area. There were major Christian centers in Jerusalem, in Antioch, in Alexandria, in Carthage, and yes, eventually in Rome. Each of these centers developed its own traditions, its own theological emphases, and its own claims to authority. The Roman Church eventually won that contest for central authority. It did so through a combination of factors, including political power, geographic positioning at the heart of the empire, and, critically, its claim to have been founded by Peter and Paul, the two most important figures in early Christianity. That claim was enormously valuable, because if you could demonstrate that your church was founded by Peter himself, you could argue that your bishop, your pope, stood in a direct line of succession from Jesus. That was not a small claim. It was the ultimate claim to religious legitimacy in the Christian world. Now, here's the thing about historical narratives. When one institution gains dominance over others, the historical record tends to be written in ways that support that dominance. Sources that challenge the dominant narrative get labeled as apocryphal, meaning outside the canon. They get dismissed as legend. They get ignored. This happened not just with African Christian traditions. It happened with many of the early Christian communities of the Middle East and Central Asia. The Ethiopian church is particularly interesting in this regard because it was never fully absorbed into either the Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox mainstream. It developed its own theology, its own canon of Scripture, which includes books not found in the Western Bible, and its own historical memory. That independence is significant because it means the Ethiopian ecclesiastical tradition has had less institutional pressure to conform its historical accounts to a Roman-centered narrative. When Ethiopian monks copied manuscripts describing apostolic movements that included African connections, they were not doing so to challenge Rome. They were doing so to preserve what their tradition remembered. And historical memory, preserved in institutions that operate outside the mainstream of political power, is sometimes where the most important fragments of truth are found. Now, I want to be careful here. This is not an argument that the Ethiopian tradition is simply correct and the Roman tradition is simply wrong. History is rarely that clean. It is entirely possible that Peter did eventually reach Rome. The physical evidence beneath St. Peter's Basilica, including bones discovered in the 20th century that Vatican archaeologists attributed to Peter, remains a subject of genuine scholarly debate. What this video is arguing is something more nuanced. It is arguing that the years before Peter's arrival in Rome, those undocumented, underexplored years, may have included movements and connections that Western history has overlooked, and that the manuscripts and traditions preserved in Ethiopia provide a legitimate, historically grounded starting point for investigating that question. This is not about deciding which version of history is true. It is about recognizing that the full history is richer, more complex, and more geographically diverse than the standard Western account suggests. Do you think the Roman Church deliberately suppressed African connections in early Christian history? Or is this more about what naturally gets preserved and what gets lost over time? That is a real historical debate worth having. Share your perspective below. Let us get more specific about the manuscript evidence. The Tigray region of northern Ethiopia is home to over 100 rock-hewn churches. Many of them are carved into cliff faces hundreds of feet above the valley floor. They are accessible only by rope or by narrow paths cut into the stone. These churches were not built for public display. They were built for preservation. The monks who founded them and maintained them over the centuries understood that the manuscripts inside those stone walls would be protected from war, from fire, from the gradual destruction of time. Many of the manuscripts housed in these monasteries have never been fully examined by outside scholars. A major international cataloging project, the Ethiopian Manuscript Microfilm Library Project, has digitized many of these texts, but the work of translation and historical analysis is still very much in progress. Among the texts that have been partially examined, there are several categories relevant to our investigation today. First, there are the liturgical texts, including the Synaxarium mentioned earlier, which contain hagiographic accounts of apostolic figures, including Peter. These accounts differ in certain details from their Western equivalents, and those differences are historically significant. Second, there are administrative and monastic rule texts, some of which trace their authority back to connections with the earliest apostolic communities, specifically referencing lines of spiritual descent that run through Alexandria and, in some accounts, through Jerusalem-based figures, including Peter. Third, there are what scholars describe as pseudo-epigraphical texts, meaning texts attributed to apostolic authors that are not part of the canonical Bible. Some of these, preserved in Ethiopia but not accepted into the Western canon, claim to record specific episodes in the lives of the apostles that canonical texts do not include. Now, pseudo-epigraphical texts require careful handling. The fact that a text claims to be written by or about an apostle does not mean it accurately reflects historical events. Many such texts were written centuries after the apostolic period, drawing on a mixture of genuine tradition, theological elaboration, and creative expansion. But historians use these texts as evidence of what communities believed about their own history. And what communities believed, especially when those beliefs were preserved in isolation from the mainstream, can sometimes preserve genuine historical memory in distorted but recoverable form. What the Ethiopian texts taken together suggest is this: the early African Christian communities did not think of themselves as a distant branch of a Roman tree. They thought of themselves as co-heirs of an apostolic tradition that had its roots in Jerusalem and had spread in multiple directions simultaneously, including into Africa, from the very beginning. They remembered connections to Peter, to Mark, to Bartholomew, not as legends absorbed from Western sources, but as traditions handed down within their own communities, in their own language, maintained in their own institutions. That is a form of historical evidence worth taking seriously. So where does this leave us? Let me be clear about what this video has and has not argued. It has not argued that Peter never went to Rome. The evidence for his presence in Rome is real, even if not conclusive. It has not argued that the Ethiopian manuscripts contain some kind of secret truth that overturns everything we know. Manuscript traditions require careful, rigorous scholarly analysis, and that work is still ongoing. What it has argued is this: there are years in Peter's life that the Western historical record does not account for. The word Babylon in Peter's letter may refer to an actual location in Egypt rather than to Rome. Mark, Peter's closest companion, definitively went to Alexandria and founded the African church there. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition preserves manuscript evidence of early connections between Peter and African Christian communities that mainstream Western history has largely overlooked. And the institutional history of the Roman Church gave it powerful reasons to locate Peter's story in Rome and minimize his connections to other centers of early Christianity. None of that proves a specific alternative history, but together it makes a compelling case that the full story of Peter is more geographically complex, more connected to Africa, and more debated among serious historians than most people realize. History, someone once said, is written by those with the power to write it down and the institutional strength to make it last. The monasteries of Ethiopia, hanging on their cliff faces, carved from volcanic rock, housing manuscripts that have survived invasions, famines, and the slow erosion of centuries, represent a different kind of historical testimony. Not written by the powerful, but preserved by the faithful. And sometimes it is in those places, away from the centers of power, that the most honest fragments of the past survive. I will leave you with this question. When you read history, whose institutions produced the sources you were reading from? And what might those sources look like if you found them carved into a cliff in Ethiopia instead of recorded in a Roman archive? Think about that. And if you have not already watched our full documentary, The Forbidden History of the 12 Disciples in Africa, I want you to go there next, because the connections between what we covered today and what you will find in that video will completely reframe how you see the entire apostolic period. Before you go, answer this in the comments. Do you trust history written by the institution with the most power to shape it? Or do you think the truth is more likely to survive in places that never had that kind of power? I read every comment, and this community's perspective genuinely shapes what we investigate next. Subscribe if you are new, and I will see you in the next chapter of this story.